Hi everybody and welcome back to 2BeLikeChrist. In today's video we're going to talk about an interesting topic, fasting, and whether or not Christians should do it and whether or not God made a place for it in the New Testament. Now if you pick up your Bible, it's not very hard to find a passage about fasting. You can find them all over the Old Testament and even in the beginning of the New Testament. People are fasting all over the place when we get to the scribes and the Pharisees in the Gospels. But what's interesting and what a lot of people don't know is that God only commanded, as far as I can tell, one day in the Old Testament, one day a year, when people were required to fast. And that day was the Day of Atonement. But what we find in the early pages of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is that the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the scribes and a lot of the Jews, they're fasting multiple times a week. And if you do a little bit of a historical study, what you'll find is that a lot of these guys were just doing voluntary fasting for devotional purposes to God. If you look in Luke chapter 18, verse 12, there's the story of the Pharisee and the tax collector, and they're both praying in very different ways. The Pharisee, one of the things that he mentions is, I fast twice a week. And so out of the goodness of their heart and their love for God, they were giving up food multiple times a week, maybe for a whole day, maybe for part of a day. What prompted this topic for me is a set of verses that's found in Matthew chapter 6, verses 16 and following. And Jesus addresses the attitudes that people have when they're doing this fasting. He says, "And when you fast, do not look gloomy like the hypocrites, for they disfigure their faces that their fastings may be seen by others. Truly, I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you fast, anoint your head and wash your face, that your fasting may not be seen by others, but by your Father who is in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you." So what you have here is a group of people, he calls them the hypocrites, and they wanted everyone to know that they were fasting. They wanted everyone to know that they were devoted to God. And so they would make themselves look really sad and emaciated and skinny, and they'd walk out in the street and they'd be like, "Oh, I'm fasting today. It's so hard." And Jesus is saying, don't be like those guys. When you fast, no one needs to know, because this is a devotion that you're having between yourself and God. And God will know. And you don't have to make yourself look terrible. And God will reward you even though you're fasting in secret. Okay, so we just talked a lot about the people in the first century. But remember, they were still under the Jewish law, or the old law, the law of Moses. And that's the context in which Jesus is making these statements. So what about fasting today? Is there a place for it? And should the New Testament church or Christians be involving themselves in fasting? What I've done on this sheet of paper is to actually make a list of just about every occurrence of fasting in the New Testament. And we'll try to get a feel for, is this something that's still relevant or something that needs to be left back in the Old Testament? So let's go through a couple of these verses really quickly. Luke chapter 2, we're told about a woman who was a prophet, Anna, and she fasted and prayed in the temple every day. In Luke chapter 18, verse 12, we have the example that we just talked about. There was the Pharisee and the tax collector, and the Pharisee is praying about how many times a week he fasts. What we have in Acts chapter 27, verse 9 is a reference to the fast, a specific day. And a lot of times if you look in the footnotes of those texts, you'll find that the fast is a reference to what we talked about earlier, the Day of Atonement under the old law. A little bit later in Acts chapter 27, verse 33, we have Paul fasting 14 days with everybody on the ship as they fight their way through a storm. But now, let me get to a few more verses that I find to be a little bit more applicable and relevant to New Testament Christian behavior. In Mark chapter 2, verse 18, and several other gospel accounts, some people come to Jesus and they say, the disciples of John the Baptist fast, but your disciples don't fast. And Jesus responds, while the bridegroom is still here, my disciples don't have any reason to fast. But when he goes away, my disciples will fast. In Acts chapter 13, we have an example of the apostles fasting and praying, and during that time, they set apart Paul and Barnabas for a special work. A chapter later, in Acts chapter 14, we have Paul and Barnabas appointing elders over a congregation, and part of that process was fasting and prayer. I also suspect that Matthew chapter 4, verse 2, where Jesus fasts 40 days before his temptation, is something that the New Testament church needs to consider as being relevant to them. I'll explain why in a second. And then one last reference in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 5. Paul talking about the relationship between a husband and a wife and the sexual needs that are there. And he says the only reason to refrain from that sexual relationship is for a time, the King James Version says, of prayer and fasting. Other versions leave out fasting and only mention prayer. And so I want to ask two questions, and the first one's a little bit, I think, it's the easier of the two. And that is there a place for fasting in the New Testament? Is there a place for fasting in your local congregation and in your life? I think based on the few verses that we just read, the answer to that question is yes, there is. And the reason I say that is because what we find is a precedent, examples of the apostles who are guided by the Holy Spirit, fasting and praying before some very significant events in the early church. And now for the second question, which I think is significantly harder and probably the reason that a lot of people avoid talking about fasting at all. And that is, what is the benefit of fasting? As far as I can tell, and correct me if I'm wrong, there is no verse in the New Testament that gives us a very clear, plain explanation saying, these are the benefits of fasting, and gives us a nice, clean list. And so as we tackle this question, we've got to look at some principles, we've got to look at the words of Jesus, and maybe we can come to at least some understanding of what the benefits may be. The first thing I think is interesting is that in Matthew chapter 6, the verses we read first in our text, Jesus does say that there is a reward from the Father for this voluntary fasting that they're participating in if they do it the correct way. Based on the context and the circumstances that we find fasting in some of these big situations in the New Testament, a lot of people suggest that fasting may bring Christians a clarity of mind, kind of clearing everything else off the table, clearing all of our other needs off the table in order to address the biggest need that we need to go to God for help. Another benefit that I think Christians may be able to receive from fasting is a practice in spiritual discipline. And this is why I say that the 40 days of fasting that Jesus did before his temptation may help us to understand the benefits of fasting and why it's still relevant. When you think about the human need for food and hunger and how food relates to that hunger, what we find is that food is almost an immediate satisfaction to hunger. You know, we have a craving, we have a desire, and I like to satisfy that craving with mac and cheese, right? And it brings me immediate satisfaction for that hunger inside of me. In the 40 days of Jesus' temptation, don't you know that probably after the first day, he had that hunger. And there would have been temptation there for him to satisfy that hunger. But the benefit of that fasting may have been that he was learning and training himself to deny immediate satisfaction to achieve his ultimate goal. Because the spiritual life and sin work in very similar ways to hunger and food. Think about it. Sin comes and it offers us an immediate satisfaction. We have a craving. Maybe it's lust. Maybe it's covetousness. Maybe it's, whatever it may be. We have a craving for something. And sin comes along and the devil comes along and he says, I can satisfy this right now. And so much of the scriptures is devoted to helping us to see that we should not take that immediate satisfaction because there is a pure and a holy God who is way more capable of satisfying us. But there may be some waiting involved. Maybe that satisfaction doesn't come right now, but it's coming for us in eternity. And so we're buffeting or training our bodies to say, I'm not going to bite on Satan's hook. I'm not going to take the bait. There's something better waiting for me. And so the 40 days of fasting that Jesus undertook may have been a physical preparation of denying oneself so that when the spiritual battle came, he was trained, he was ready to deny himself. In that sense, reject the immediate satisfaction that Satan was offering. Remember what he came to him with first? Food. And to say, no, I'm not going to take your bait, Satan. I'm going to look for God and the glory that he will give me in the end. And so we may see the same result through fasting, and that is that we're learning physically to deny ourselves immediate pleasure so that we can then translate that into a spiritual discipline. The reason that I can't give you a crisp, clean explanation of the benefits of fasting is because I don't necessarily see one in the New Testament. And I think there are principles that maybe help to explain that, but I don't want to step over the authority of the scriptures and try to provide you with something that the Bible doesn't provide us with. I think the best opportunity for us to understand the real benefits of fasting would be to try it. And I know that that's not a very popular thing to suggest because, hey, I love food too, and I don't want to go a day without eating. But from what we find in the New Testament, we may be missing out on some benefits that God has shown us because we're not willing to discipline ourselves physically to reap the spiritual benefit. I appreciate you watching the video. If you have any comments, and I know this is a hotly debated topic, write them down below. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, do that. Like the video, share it, Facebook, wherever. And I can't wait to see you next time. See ya.